Tonight, we're grabbing a wobbly wheeled cart and rolling it straight into one of the most quietly dangerous places of the 20th century, the American supermarket of the 1970s. Not the farmer's market your grandmother romanticized, not the wholesome wood-paneled grocer of a nostalgia commercial. I am talking about the real thing, a fluorescent-lit cathedral of convenience, where dinner came in a foiled tray. Bread glowed faintly, like it had opinions, and the word cheese had quietly become more of a legal gray area than a dairy product. It was the golden age of better living through chemistry, and the chemistry was coming for your casserole. To understand what happened, you have to understand what changed after World War II. The American food system underwent a transformation so complete that a time traveler from 1940 would barely recognize a grocery shelf by 1975. The war had industrialized food production on a massive scale, and when the soldiers came home, that industrial machine pivoted straight to the consumer market. Factory processing replaced home preparation. Preservatives replaced freshness. And convenience became the religion of the American kitchen. The freezer aisle exploded. The snack aisle multiplied. And somewhere in the corporate boardrooms, a calculation was made that would define a generation. If you could make it cheaper, make it last longer, and make it taste addictive enough, nobody would ask what was actually in it. The television dinner was the gateway drug, introduced in the 1950s by Swanson. It promised the impossible, a complete meal, ready in minutes, eaten on a folding tray in front of the television. By the 1970s, the frozen food aisle had become a frozen food continent. Salisbury steak, fried chicken, pot pies, fish sticks, fried chicken, pot pies, fish sticks, everything breaded again, and everything sealed in compartments that kept the apple dessert from touching the mashed potatoes, which were themselves a marvel of reconstitution. What nobody told you was that these meals contained astonishing levels of sodium, preservatives like Ban-Hay and BAT, artificial colors, and trans fats from partially hydrogenated oils. The convenience was real, the cost was hidden, and it would take decades to show up on the medical charts. In the land of diet culture, saccharin was king. This artificial sweetener, discovered by accident in 1879, when a chemist forgot to wash his hands before dinner, had been around for decades. But in the 1970s, it became an obsession. Tap Cola, the diet drink of choice, was sweetened with saccharin, and millions of Americans swallowed it daily, believing they were making a healthy choice. Then, in 1977, the FDA dropped a bombshell. Studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in rats. The agency proposed a ban. The public cancer in rats. The agency proposed a ban. The public revolted tab like it was gold. Congress eventually backed down, slapping a warning label on saccharin products instead. But the damage to public trust was done. If the government had to put a cancer warning on your diet soda, What else was lurking in the aisles? If saccharin was the scandal, red dye number 2 was the horror story. For decades. This brilliant crimson additive had been coloring everything from maraschino cherries to hot dogs to cough syrup. It was everywhere. It was in foods children ate daily. And then Soviet scientists published research linking it to cancer. The FDA, under enormous public pressure, finally banned it in 1976. The ban was seismic. Suddenly, red foods disappeared from shelves. M&Ms removed their red candies. Jell-O changed its formulas. Hot dog manufacturers scrambled for alternatives. And American mothers started asking questions they had never thought to ask before. If red dye number 2 had been in the food supply for decades before anyone noticed it was dangerous, what else was hiding in plain sight? Of all the invisible poisons in the 1970s, supermarket trans fats were the most insidious. Partially hydrogenated vegetable oil was marketed as the healthy alternative to butter and lard. Margarine was sold as the modern, scientific, heart-smart choice. Crisco promised better baking with vegetable shortening that never went bad, which should have been the first clue that something was very wrong. A fat that never spoils is a fat your body cannot process. Here is perhaps the most damning part of the entire story. For most of the 1970s, food labels were essentially meaningless. Ingredients could be listed under vague, umbrella terms like spices or natural flavors. Nutritional information was voluntary, not required. Serving sizes were deliberately tiny to make the numbers look better. A product could call itself cheese when it contained barely any actual cheese. A fruit drink could be almost entirely sugar water and corn syrup with a tiny fraction of juice. The word natural had no legal definition, so it meant nothing. The word healthy was thrown around with wild abandon. And the average shopper standing in those fluorescent aisles had absolutely no way to know what they were really feeding their family. The labels were not just unhelpful, they were actively misleading, designed by food companies to make dangerous products look wholesome. The 1970s were also the decade when plastic packaging went from novel to ubiquitous. Canned foods were lined with epoxy resins containing bisphenol A, better known as BPA. Plastic wrap clung to every leftover. Tupperware containers filled every refrigerator. Microwave-safe plastics began heating food in contact with compounds that nobody had studied for long-term human exposure. BPA is an endocrine disruptor, meaning it interferes with your hormones. It was discovered in the 1930s and was originally investigated as a synthetic estrogen before being repurposed for plastics. Let that sink in. A chemical explored as a hormone drug was put into food containers and can linings, and it would take until the 21st century before regulators started pulling it from baby bottles while shoppers focused on additives inside the boxes. A quieter problem was coating the produce. The 1970s were the peak of industrial pesticide use in American agriculture. DT had been banned in 1972 after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring exposed its devastating environmental impact. But the chemicals that replaced it were often just as troubling. Aldicarb, Parathion, Captain, names that sound like villains from a science fiction novel, were sprayed liberally on the fruits and vegetables that families believed were the healthy part of their diet. Farm workers suffered the most acute exposures, but residues made their way into every American kitchen. The system assumed that small amounts were safe. That assumption was never properly tested, and it protected the agricultural industry far more effectively than it protected the consumer. But the 1970s were also the decade when pushback began. Consumer advocates like Ralph Nader fought for labeling laws and safety standards. The Clean Water Act and the Toxic Substances Control Act became law. The FDA, under pressure, started taking a harder look at food additives. The organic food movement, dismissed as hippie nonsense by the establishment, began its long, slow crawl toward the mainstream. The first natural food stores opened, small and dusty and dismissed as crank operations by the supermarket chains that dominated American shopping. But they were a start. They represented the first flicker of awareness that the system was not working, that cheaper and faster and longer lasting might come with costs nobody had calculated. The pushback was slow and it was messy, but it was real, and it would eventually change everything about how America thought about food. So where does that leave us? Today's supermarket is different in ways that matter, and sadly familiar in ways that do not. We have nutrition labels now, thanks to the laws pushed through in the aftermath of the 1970s scandals. We have ingredient lists that mean something. Mostly we have organic options and farmers markets, and an awareness that would have been science fiction to a 1975 shopper, but the fundamental tension has not changed. The food industry still prioritizes profit over health. New additives appear faster than regulators can evaluate them. Processing techniques grow more sophisticated, and the marketing grows more deceptive the next time you turn a box around and actually read the back. Remember that this tiny act of scrutiny was hard-won. It took scandals, bans, congressional hearings, and a generation of sick people to earn you the right to know what is in your food. That right is not guaranteed. It was fought for, and it could be lost. Read the label. Always read the label.